This is Frontline on Air. Major stories on the go.
Israel delivers West Asia its Sarajevo moment. Netanyahu sees a historic chance to reshape West Asia, but with no strategy in sight, mass killings appear to be Israel's principal war aim. Talmiz Ahmad.
Voice by Rakesh Sharma, Timber Media.
On the night of October 25-26, Israel launched 2 waves of air attacks on military targets in 3 provinces in Iran: Elam, Khuzestan, and Tehran. With these attacks described as an exercise in self-defense, Israel has said that its mission is complete. The attacks were a retaliation for Iran's missile attacks of October 1st. A year into the war in Gaza, images of the carnage now have a predictable pattern. Aircraft strikes with fire and fury, followed by plumes of smoke. Frenzied movements of screaming ambulances, and a slower churn of donkey carts laden with the bleeding and the dead. Row upon row of the injured and the undernourished on blood-soaked beds in dilapidated hospitals, and above all, dozens of shrouds of the anonymous dead. Periodically, we see long lines of the displaced and the dispossessed walking through broken streets to reach a new sanctuary described by their foe as safe, which, all too frequently, turns into a fresh battlefield. The news bars on our screens emotionlessly set out the numbers of the wounded and the dead, which rise every day by several dozen, and on some days even by a few hundred. The newsreader merely shares the total number of the departed on the day, as the line on this unfeeling graph climbs inexorably upwards, while the relentless killing machine mows through this accursed land. A year has passed since this present conflict began, and from a few hundred, the death toll has now reached over 42,000, with no signs of an end. Most of the dead are women and children, while another 100,000 people are reported to be wounded. Many more, perhaps thousands of them, lie under the rubble to be disinterred in some remote future, possibly by bewildered strangers seeking to make sense of this devastation. The drumbeat of death has a staccato rhythm that numbs the mind and fills the soul with aching anguish. Gaza has joined the annals of recent military encounters where Western military prowess has showered its ruthless firepower upon hapless Asian and African peoples and reduced them to dust and ashes. Hiroshima, Algiers, My Lai, Tora Bora, Baghdad, Sirte, Mosul, Raqqa, the list goes on. A beleaguered Prime Minister. For most of the past year, as the death toll in Gaza mounted, Israel and its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have attracted increasing domestic and international opprobrium. Although Israel claimed it was making progress in the war by eliminating Hamas cadres, what most of the world could see was the killing of women and children, with no indication that it had a strategy or even an endgame in sight. Mass killing, it appeared, was the principal war aim of the Prime Minister, who faces sharp criticism at home for failing to protect its people from the rampaging Hamas on October 7th, 2023. On that day, for once, Hamas fighters initiated the conflict and inflicted considerable damage and hurt on a people who, over the previous several decades, had killed or wounded hundreds of Palestinians for every 10 casualties of their own. By March this year, even the normally supportive US president seemed to have had enough. Joe Biden called publicly for an immediate ceasefire, increased humanitarian assistance for the Palestinians, and advocated moves towards a 2-state solution. The US, for the first time in the conflict, even backed a UN Security Council resolution echoing these points, while senior public figures criticized Netanyahu personally. Biden even sanctioned a pier at Gaza to provide relief supplies, as Israel would not allow humanitarian aid by land. But the pier was blown away by the winds of the Mediterranean, a metaphor for the US's disoriented and floundering role amid this cruel bloodletting. The International Court of Justice indicated that Israel's actions in Gaza could be termed a genocide, and a little later called for the unconditional vacation of all occupied territories by Israel. None of this has deterred the beleaguered Israeli Prime Minister, who remains intent on staying in power by keeping his bloodthirsty and racist coalition intact. Netanyahu described Israel as being surrounded by a ring of fire and of confronting Iran and Iran-sponsored Axis of Resistance militants in Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. In July, in an audacious attack in Tehran, Israeli missiles killed the Doha-based Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, who was attending the swearing-in of Iran's president Masoud Pezeshkian. Goliath trounces David. Israel then notched up dramatic attacks in September. On September 17th and 18th, Lebanon was rocked by thousands of explosions. The pagers of Hezbollah cadres exploded simultaneously, followed a day later by their walkie-talkies. Several thousand Hezbollah fighters were killed or injured. Israel thus dramatically projected its technological reach by detonating the small explosives it had inserted into the communication devices sold to the fighters, which, ironically, were used by Hezbollah to avoid the tracking of their mobile phones. The attack has been described as the most extensive physical supply chain attack in history. The explosions were followed by massive Israeli air attacks on south and central Lebanon and the targeted killing of Hezbollah leaders. On September 27th, Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader since 1992, was killed in a bomb attack along with Abbas Nilfaroshan, an Iranian general. However, Hezbollah's missile attacks on Israeli targets have continued, making it impossible for the 60,000 Israelis displaced from northern Israel to return home. On October 1st, Iran launched a barrage of 180 ballistic missiles on Israeli targets in the second direct military encounter between these West Asian enemies after the tit-for-tat exchange of missiles in April. While Israel's initial response was dismissive, it appears that about 20 or more missiles directed at military targets got through and hit some air bases and possibly a few aircraft, though the extent of damage is not known. While contemplating its response to the Iranian attacks, Israel accomplished a crowning achievement with the killing on October 16th of Yahya Sinwar, who had become Hamas's military and political leader after Haniyeh's death. Sinwar was regarded as the mastermind of the October 7th attacks. His killing, therefore, was an Israeli priority. He was known to be in the tunnels of Gaza but had eluded capture until then. After Sinwar's death was confirmed the next day, the Israeli military said, quote, "Justice has been delivered. Every single terrorist who harms Israelis will pay the price." End quote. While Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris saw Sinwar's death as an opportunity to end the war, Netanyahu vowed to continue the fight with full force until the remaining hostages, numbering about 100, were returned. The scholar James Dorsey noted that the opportunity to end the spiral of conflict in West Asia came and went within hours. Netanyahu's aggression gained fresh impetus after an alleged Hezbollah missile attack on his residence in Jerusalem on October 19th. Describing it as an attempted assassination, Netanyahu said the perpetrators would pay a heavy price for their grave mistake. In the new battlefields of West Asia, Goliath is vanquishing David. The Sarajevo moment. After the October 1st Iranian missile attack, Netanyahu warned of retaliating with a massive strategic strike. Although Israel has claimed that with its latest strikes on Iran, its mission is complete, the region and perhaps the world faces its Sarajevo moment, as the two West Asian rivals could still escalate the conflict into a region-wide conflagration that brings in the US and other players. A Pentagon spokesman recalled that World War I, quote, started as a very regional thing. Then suddenly you had multiple nations involved in a 4-year protracted conflict that became very complicated and very hard to stop, unquote. He said that US efforts are directed at preventing that from happening in this case, but few believe that the US has either the will or the capacity to pursue it effectively. The US told Israel to stay off Iran's nuclear and energy facilities, and Israel reportedly agreed to confine itself to military targets. although its officials stated that, quote, final decisions will be based on Israel's national security needs, unquote. To augment Israel's security, the US has deployed a THAAD, that is Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Missile Defense Battery, along with 100 soldiers in Israel. After the latest attacks on Iran, matters could escalate if militants in Syria, Lebanon, or Yemen were to launch strikes on Israel and possibly inflict heavy civilian casualties. Iran and Israel have also been embroiled in an information war. Iranian sources have issued dire warnings of unspecified destruction in Israel, with vague remarks hinting at deploying a nuclear weapon to deter Israel's bellicosity. Iran's foreign minister has also traveled across the Gulf to discuss the impending conflict and to urge Gulf Cooperation Council states to remain neutral and not allow Israeli aircraft to violate their airspace. Israeli commentators have spoken of the present situation as offering a now-or-never moment to destroy Iran's nuclear, military, and economic capabilities, with its nuclear potential being the principal target. Unnamed sources are also quoted as saying that a massive Israeli attack would drag the US into joining the assault to help Israel complete its military mission. The UK daily The Telegraph has pointed out that Iran's nuclear program is viewed as an existential threat by Israel, and hence Israel has acquired the capabilities to attack heavily protected nuclear sites deep inside Iran. The Economist has noted that Netanyahu believes that Israel has a historic chance to reshape the region. At least some of its generals assess that Israel has a rare momentum in its favor. They seem ready to risk a devastating conflagration, The Economist writes. The colonial mindset. As West Asia stands poised at its Sarajevo moment and prepares itself for region-wide devastation, it would be instructive to recall the thinking and associated political developments that have led to this point in regional history, and reflect on where the region could be going. As is known, the State of Israel is the product of a settler colonial project in West Asia to resettle the Jews persecuted in Europe for nearly 2 millennia on lands associated with Jewish prophets and ancestors in the Old Testament by forcing out their cousins who live there, the Palestinians. Theodor Herzl, the leader of the Zionist movement in Europe, understood the problem that resettling Jews in Palestine posed. He wrote in his diary in 1895, quote, "We shall try to spirit the penniless Palestinian population across the border by procuring employment for it in transit countries, while denying it employment in our own country." End quote. Herzl viewed Israel as an extension of Europe. He wrote that Israel would, quote, "form a part of a wall of defense for Europe in Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism." Unquote. These two concepts, the forcible expulsion of the original inhabitants of Palestine and Israel's affiliation with European civilization, are at the heart of Israel's identity. In 1923, as the Zionist project to settle Jews in Palestine gathered pace, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the leader of the right wing in Zionist thinking, reflected both the colonial nature of the enterprise and the expectation of resistance when he wrote, quote, "Every native population in the world resists colonialists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. This is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing." End quote. Jabotinsky understood, in the Palestinian-American historian Rashid Khalidi's words, that resorting to, quote, "the constant threat of the use of massive force against the Arab majority," unquote, would be necessary to implement the Zionist project. This task would be facilitated by viewing the Palestinians as the other, and, in settler colonial tradition, painting them as backward, uncivilized, and a violent, murderous, and irrational obstacle to progress and modernity. This othering was institutionalized in Israel through rigorously enforced discriminations and disabilities and codified in law, the Basic Law, the nation-state of the Jewish people, passed in 2018. In all its military encounters with the Palestinian other, Israel has been guided by its affiliation with Western civilization, particularly the settler colonial mindset and practice fine-tuned by the British in their colonies and in the US in encounters with Native Americans. This has meant viewing the Palestinians and other Arabs as uncivilized barbarians who only understand the language of force, and in military encounters abandoning Western norms of civilized war and resorting to unrestrained brutality. As the scholar Patrick Porter has noted in Military Orientalism, Eastern War Through Western Eyes, Western colonialists concluded that uncivilized races mistook leniency for timidity. Since these fanatics and savages needed to be thoroughly cowed down, it was necessary to abandon norms of restraint to defeat them. This thinking, Porter points out, is alluring because, quote, it enables people to think of themselves as civilized while practicing brutality. End quote. This mindset and approach have defined Israel's military encounters with Palestinians in the occupied territories and incursions in other Arab lands. Israel has invariably described these conflicts as existential threats, justifying the massive use of force and the resulting large number of casualties. By 2006, Israel had made psychologically directed violence central to its military doctrine as part of its punishment strategy. Thus, Lebanon was subjected to extensive bombardment to penalize the Lebanese government and the people of southern Beirut and curb their backing for Hezbollah. The strategy failed, and popular anger was directed at the aggressor and not Hezbollah, as is happening at present. Moderating hubris. The killings of high-profile Hamas, Hezbollah and Iranian figures within the space of a month have created a deep and pervasive sense of triumph across Israel. Netanyahu's personal standing, which had reached a low point after the October 7th attacks, has risen. He has restored his status as the country's Mr. Security. Israeli reports say that he is possibly awaiting Trump's return to the White House to mobilize a joint assault on Iran's nuclear assets. Netanyahu, the Israel-based commentator Ben Caspit, says, is finally back to himself. Observers recognize that much of this has been achieved by Netanyahu rejecting most of the rules and norms of military encounters that had kept earlier confrontations limited in scope and duration. Thus, he has treated with contempt all international criticisms of the mass killings, publicly shrugged off Biden's calls for humanitarian aid and ceasefire, launched massive air and ground assaults on Lebanon, and perpetrated targeted killings that have led to direct military exchanges with Iran. Mona Yakubian, whose work at the United States Institute of Peace has focused on West Asia and North Africa, writes in Foreign Affairs that Netanyahu, quote, is ready to gamble that doubling down on military force to restore deterrence and disrupt the threat posed by the axis of resistance outweighs the risks of provoking a region-wide war. End quote. With Hamas and Hezbollah decapitated and Israel's demonstrated ability to withstand Iran's shower of drones and missiles, the demand is now for a war against Iran. The cry has gone out that Judgment Day has arrived. Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has led the cry for battle, saying, quote, Israel has now its greatest opportunity in 50 years to change the face of the Middle East, West Asia. Now that Hezbollah and Hamas are paralyzed, Iran stands exposed. End quote. As the Lebanese commentator Ghassan Salameh noted in a recent issue of Financial Times, Netanyahu has now joined the long line of leaders: Alexander, Cyrus, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Arabs, the Turks, the British and the French, and most recently the Americans, who have sought to reshape West Asia to suit their interests. All these efforts, he points out, have failed, while state order has remained fragile and interstate relations contentious. Despite this negative history, Netanyahu has committed himself to shaping a new regional scenario. There is already talk in Israel about annexing Gaza and the West Bank and moving the Palestinian populations into Sinai in Egypt and Jordan, respectively. Some visionaries have also revived historical claims of Eretz Israel, Greater Israel, that would include parts of Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Is this grand vision sustainable? Despite Israel's extraordinary achievements, there remain significant areas of uncertainty. 1. Israel still does not have a strategic vision for itself and its occupied territories, and hence does not know when to declare mission accomplished. In the absence of an endgame in sight, Israel's only way forward appears to be continued military action to affirm dominance, long-term military occupation of Palestinian territories and possibly southern Lebanon, and to push for the expulsion of Palestinians for the expansion of Jewish settlements. Most of the destruction that Israel has inflicted on the region has been made possible by the generous and unconditional supply of American weapons and diplomatic backing, which have enabled Israel to continue its mass killings with total impunity. But, as former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Dana Stroul, has noted in Foreign Affairs, after a year of fighting, quote, the IDF is tired, munition stockpiles are depleted, Israel's economy is weak, and its international and regional standing have significantly eroded. End quote. This calls for a more moderate and accommodative approach from Israel rather than the aggressive posturing that its Prime Minister is engaged in. 2. Tactical advantages obtained through targeted killings of militia leaders do not translate into long-term strategic benefits. Israel has killed several Palestinian and Hezbollah leaders over the past decades without obtaining improved security conditions for its people. As Stephen Cook writes in Foreign Policy, while the Israelis have been proficient in avenging blood, quote, they have never managed to bring an appreciable end to violent resistance. Violent death would be an inspiration for yet more resistance. Even as a leader is killed, others will rise, as they always have, to continue to resist. End quote. 3. Iran. Netanyahu has vowed a massive strategic attack on Iran. Although full details of this are not available, several commentators have warned about the implications of this. They have noted that such attacks, including those on its nuclear or energy facilities, will push Iran to pursue credible deterrence, placing the two countries in an escalatory trap. The American political scientist Stephen Wald has pointed out that, quote, Israel keeps giving them, that is Iran, additional incentives to want the ultimate deterrent, which will make Israel's recent successes remarkably short-sighted. End quote. Implications for Israel. Several commentators have suggested alternative routes to shape the future. These have focused on the limits of relying on brute force to achieve its goals and the toll this will take on Israel's own domestic order. Israel is now in the grip of extreme right-wing leaders who have coarsened the national fiber and injected into the national psyche a propensity towards racism, violence, and cruelty. Walt warns that Netanyahu's ever-deepening affiliation with the country's ultra-religious and ultra-nationalist groups could encourage its moderate and secular citizens to migrate, joining the 500,000 Israelis who already live abroad, with most having no plans to return. This will have negative implications for the economy, particularly the high-tech sector. Israel's aggressive posture in the occupied territories, including its ideas of depopulating resident Palestinians, will also embroil the country in persistent conflict, increasing death tolls, widespread destruction, humanitarian disasters, and constant displacement. It will require prolonged occupation by Israel's military of hostile territories in Gaza, the West Bank, and southern Lebanon, with long-term attrition and periodic atrocities corroding the force's morale and fighting spirit. These considerations, among others, have led Aluf Ben, the editor-in-chief of Haaretz, writing in Foreign Affairs, to assert that the current situation feels like defeat. He criticizes Netanyahu for policies that prolong the conflict in order to stay in power. While conceding that the ongoing military assaults enjoy considerable domestic backing, he warns that historically, both Gaza and Lebanon have been quagmires for the Israeli forces. Netanyahu, he points out, now leads a deeply divided country, with Israelis being compelled to accept, quote, institutionalized apartheid in the West Bank, the permanent occupation in Gaza and perhaps southern Lebanon, and growing autocracy and theocracy at home. End quote. Despite the cacophony generated by the ongoing carnage, commentators warn that with the increasing influence of ultra-right elements, Israel faces international isolation, which could have implications for the diplomatic and military support it now enjoys. Israel's ongoing infliction of violence and cruelty hardly make it the bastion of civilization against barbarians that Herzl had described over a century ago. The alternative path to attaining security for Israel and long-term regional peace requires a sincere Israeli commitment towards a viable Palestinian state in the occupied territories. The American political scientist Dalia Dasake has written in Foreign Affairs that true victory is not possible without peace, and argues that the new Middle East sought by Israel should be one, quote, where Israel is fully accepted, trading and engaging with its neighbors, instead of one that entails perpetual occupation and perpetual war, end quote. This could be the best outcome of the death and destruction that have suffused the biblical lands this past year.
Talmiz Ahmed is a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Oman and the UAE. He holds the Ram Sathe Chair for International Studies, Symbiosis International University, Pune. His book, West Asia at War, Repression, Resistance and Great Power Games was published by HarperCollins in 2022.
This is Frontline on Air. Major stories on the go.